Let's talk a little bit about the sex workers in question. For the benefit of our listeners, maybe some of them have hired sex workers in their past, and let's aim this answer towards the people who maybe don't even know if they've ever met a sex worker. Let's get into some of the stats here on sex workers. Who are they? What percentage of them are male? What percentage do you think are transgendered? Anything, and if you don't have stats available...
I don't have stats. I can tell you that probably about less than 10% of the industry is male. About 10% of the industry are street workers. I don't really have, to be honest, an average. Like I could say most people between the ages of 20 and 38. Again, it varies. Like it's a very varied industry, but depending on what the needs are.
Maybe can I ask you some questions about some of the sex workers that you've come into contact with in your role as an activist?
Yeah.
How many of them were transgendered?
A lot. It depends what kind of action you're doing, but there are a lot of transgender sex workers, mainly M to X working. How many? It's hard to say. I would say less than 10% again, but it might be as small as 3%. Those stats aren't exactly something I can offer up.
Okay.
But the majority of the industry is women working because that's sort of what. Yeah.
Okay. We're looking at here stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the stereotype of a sex worker is usually a woman who's either not very smart or in a very desperate situation, usually controlled by a pimp, a man who's managing all of her money and she doesn't get a cent. I'd like to know, based on your experience as an activist and with the sex workers that you have met and fighting for their rights, which of these stereotypes are true and what part of the stereotypes are myths?
Yes, everyone thinks that sex workers are all on drugs and are uneducated, etc., and have been abused when they were younger. And of course, you will find some people who do fit that stereotype, but I can't say that the majority of people do. I think that you'll find people who've been sexually assaulted or sexually abused in their childhood in all types of jobs, as much as you'll find people who do drugs in all types of jobs. It's just that a lot of people assume that most sex workers adhere to that stereotype, and they don't. It's very varied. Some people use drugs, some people don't. Some people use drugs recreationally, and I think, look at the student population of how many people use drugs recreationally. So it's really important to know that most sex workers, a lot of sex workers don't adhere to that stereotype, and it's important to not assume that there's one reason for somebody entering into the sex trade or working in the sex trade. So, yeah.
Let's talk about the different types of sex workers.
Okay.
You have people working on sex phone lines.
Yeah, you've got people working in domination, people working on the phone lines, people working as escorts in massage parlors, as dancers, on the street, in brothels, online work, pornography.
Well, you talked about dominatrix.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's my question. BDSM dominatrix, who is hired to help satisfy a client fetish, may not necessarily involve sex.
That's right.
For example, somebody might get off on being made to act like a slave and scrub the kitchen floor. Although that provides some sexual satisfaction for the client, it's not sex.
No.
But it is not defined as sex. Would that still be considered sex work?
Yeah, because the person who's normally providing that service will be having sex sometimes, and so a lot of the times they'll consider themselves. If they'll say I'm a dominatrix, they might not say I'm a sex worker, but domination is, it is related to sex and sexual pleasure, and so you still are selling a sexual service.
Even if there's no active penetration, even if there's no...
it is all for the purposes of getting a hard-on for the client, or all for the purposes of sexual pleasure. Wrapped up in a lot of issues, not issues, but a lot of other
fetishes
and intentions, etc. But it's definitely...
Doesn't this sound like thought control almost. I mean,
it is that as well, but I mean, most people who are offering that service will come across a client who does want to have anal penetration, for example, or some sort of like nipple clamps, or some sort of sexual endeavor, really. I mean, at some point it does usually involve something to do with sex, even if there's no penetration. I mean, it's about sort of stepping outside of the box about how you define sex, I think. Not you, but I mean, people.
No, I've decided that I'm going to step in and I'm going to dictate everything.
There you go.
And it all begins with the radio show, man.
There you go.
Today the radio show, tomorrow I control the world.